Very good. Well, thank you for inviting me and having this chance to talk to you about. Do you see the presentation? I just see myself here.
Yes, I see the presentation, so I'm assuming everyone else can as well.
That's very good. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this topic. I just want to start off by a few words about my background, because I think that might be relevant to when we're talking about the history of Norwegian aquaculture and the development. And I come from a small island off the coast of Norway, where kind of fisheries has a very strong tradition that has been very important industry. And I see it also as a hobby genealogist that there is actually, I descend from fishermen for many generations back, and I'm actually the first one in my family not starting a career within fisheries. But at home, I've seen the development of the aquaculture industry in the home municipality, and then I also started off at the University of Tromsø in northern Norway to study aquaculture. But I jumped on some other opportunities to study biology in the Arctic before years later found myself working with development of the fishery and aquaculture industries on the west coast of Norway. Before I start talking about aquaculture, I want to give you a backdrop of Innovation Norway as well. We're owned by the Ministry of Trade and Regional County Municipalities, and we are the government's most important tool for implementing the government's strategies in business development in Norway. We work on assignments from 7 different ministries as well as regional municipalities, and that means we have a central role when Norway have run larger industrial development programs. We have a range of different services like providing expertise and networks, but a huge part of our operations in Norway is actually related to providing capital in the forms of grants, loans, and guarantees. And I see you are discussing some of the same type of instruments in developing the aquaculture industry in the US as well, which is kind of interesting to share some experience. And we also have a distributed network of offices both within Norway, but also in around 30 cities around the world that works close with the aquaculture industry. And I've been lucky to have been working close with the industry during my 4 years here in Canada as well. So having seen this development, what was it with Norway that made this development possible? What steps were taken in the past that could be useful for us and you to learn from shaping the future of the industry? How did Norway actually go from this level of the industry into the modern day aquaculture industry as we know it today, being our second biggest export industry after oil and gas? Looking at the map, it's obvious that not very surprising why we call ourselves an ocean nation. The rugged landscape gave us a good shelter from cold waters, but at the same time, it was hard to cultivate and develop an effective and reliable food supply. The ocean, on the other hand, had vast fish resources that was not only sufficient to feed our own population, but also gave room for trade, and fishing became one of the cornerstones in Norwegian value creation. And it's been the main reason why so large part of the population is dispersed along the coast. But why is this relevant now? The close connection to the ocean has since early on been developed and has become a very key component in both our history, obviously, but also our culture and identity. And the pride we carry in mastering the oceans is clearly seen in development of the ocean-based industries today. Necessity is the mother of innovation is an old English saying, and in many ways, Norwegian social and business life is built on this premise. We're a small country with challenging and to some extent inhospitable natural environment, and thus we must continually questioning existing solutions and search for new ones. Given our small population, Norway is dependent on collaboration. This is hardwired into the Norwegian model, with its flat organizational structure, high level of trust, and close collaboration between people. Over the decades, the Norwegian business community has had to solve a number of extraordinary challenges, such as shipping in the Arctic region, oil production on the seabed, and sustainable management of substantial fish stocks. We have no other option. We are pioneers because we have to be. And that is how we became a global player in the fields of oil and gas, shipping, and seafood. A big part of Norway's population, as said, lives close to the coastline, and seafood remains a key ingredient in our national diet. But only 3% of the world's population's protein intake come from seafood. As the global population grows and climate change challenge food production worldwide, it makes sense to source a larger share of future global food production from the sea. And that is a task that the Norwegian industry not only agrees on, but also are taking great pride in acting on and making the necessary changes to achieve a more sustainable food production. Norway lives from and with nature. Consequently, we have learned the importance of the sustainable use of natural resources. Living in the north have taught us that we will be the first victims if our fragile ecosystems are getting out of balance. And we have a great self-interest in managing our resources wisely. For example, our tradition for limiting fish catches has kept Norwegian fishing stocks stable and sustainable for generations. Also within fish farming and the development of processes and technologies, we see a strengthened focus on developing sustainable solutions. And for Innovation Norway, sustainability is a key factor in our assessment of application for grants and loans. But we see that the industry is also seeing this as a self-interest in building sustainable business models that in the longer term create competitive advantages. So with this backdrop, how can we explain some of the key factors that resulted in this development? I will present some of the key factors involved and give you some insight into how this came around. Now we'll look closer at the ambitions and the political will, research and development, education, capital and finance, innovation and cluster development, and finally also regulations. These latter topics will also be covered by Ragnar Tvetros coming after me, so I will just touch lightly into that. Let's start with the visions and ambitions and policies first. Perhaps one of the most important prerequisites for the development of the industry is to have visionary politicians, industry partners, and other stakeholders to agree on an ambition and set some hairy goals. Let me be clear, I'm not saying there have not been any conflicts and intense debating in Norway regarding where the industry is going or where it should go. But there has, in general, been a very wide agreement across traditional political divides that this industry is key to our economy and as such, as a key to our future welfare system. And although the political and academic system has been key to the development, the perhaps most important asset in the early years was the strong ties the industry had with the fishery and the maritime industries along the coast. This was an industry that did not start out of the blue. In the first pioneering years, there was a lot of trial and error, and the indications that this could become a huge export industry weren't actually very obvious. However, after coming to a point where they could manage some of the key factors and get some proof of concept, we could see that more efforts being put into more structured research and development. Both public and private research institutions started to take closer looks at parts of the value chain. For example, when it comes to developing broodstock material, they made use of principles and methods that has been developed for dairy cattle way earlier. In parallel to building up research and development capacity, Norway also has built up financial support system to fuel the research, development, and innovation efforts. This has also been concerted effort with different players like the Research Council and Innovation Norway, funding R&D projects at different stages and supported by co-development of strategies and plans. Now also the industry themselves contribute with a substantial amount of funding through the Norwegian Seafood Research Fund. And this is a fund that is funded by taking a cut of the export value of seafood from Norway and is put into larger strategic R&D projects that are of vital interest to the seafood industry. As the industry grew, a new technology was developed and implemented. The need for a skilled workforce grew in parallel. Not only was there a need for skilled people on an academic level, but perhaps just as much on an operational level. Most schools in Norway are public schools, and the development of new programs on both high school level as well as university level are partly influenced by our local and national policymakers, and of course also the industry needs. One such example of high schools is located in Austevoll, outside Bergen on the west coast of Norway. And Austevoll is one of the biggest hubs within fisheries and aquaculture in Norway. Here the students get training on academic skills as well as their practical skills, preparing them to be highly relevant for the industry right after their examination. The development of programs and schools that covers industry needs has been a cooperation between the industry and the educational authorities on both a national as well as a regional level. The industry is also involved partly in the schedule of the students by, for example, offering apprenticeships and practical industrial training. But I think this is an area where Norway still has a lot to learn from countries like US, where those programs are more common than with what we see in Norway. The aquaculture industry is very capital intensive with a high degree of risk, as they are exposed to so many external factors that varies greatly over time. A capital system with knowledge about the industry and the risk factors they are exposed to is therefore a key component to the growth and development of the industry. Private capital is of course a prerequisite, and that has since the early years of the industry been a backbone in the capital access, primarily from related ocean-based industries that solve opportunities in the aquaculture industry. But private capital alone has not been enough to leverage the growth that we have seen. Public funding has been an important addition to take out some risk in some type of investments, especially within innovation and R&D. But besides that, the public financing has played a minor role with regards to the scaling of the industry. It has been far more important that the banks and at the later stage also external investors enter the arena. A few decades ago, we saw some creative constructions in the industry that didn't necessarily have a successful outcome. But since then, through a comprehensive consolidation of the growers as well as the supplier industry, we have seen a relatively well-functional financial system that gives the industry the capacity to develop and grow. I also want to mention here that most of the biggest players on the arena are now listed on the Oslo Stock Exchange. And this has also led to a well-regulated and transparent financial side of the industry. It was interesting to hear the ideas you had around innovations in clusters, because that has been a key component also within the development of the Norwegian industry. Over the decade where the industry has overcome one challenge after the other, there's always been new challenges coming up. The production system getting more and more complex, and with more and more players entering the scene, there was an opening for a development of a more specialized supplier industry. When the industry got big enough and with good economic results, the supplier industry saw an opportunity to develop new technology that solved the problem that arose for the growers. And with that, we also saw a race in the supplier industry where the best solution could see a great upside. And the new solutions didn't only come from the companies already established in the aquaculture industry. When we had the last downturn in the oil and gas industry a decade ago, a lot of highly skilled engineers were let go. And a lot of them actually went into the aquaculture industry to create new advanced solutions. But also technology from other related sectors like shipbuilding and fisheries has found its way into the aquaculture industry. This being an industry that has had much of its development in rural areas has to some extent actually helped the industry. In these open and transparent communities, it's easy to identify who has the right skills to help out developing the industry. And there's always been a good deal of cooperation between companies. But mind you, that is not to say there has not been a competition, because that has been perhaps one of the most important drivers in developing the technology in the industry. This balance between competition and cooperation has led to the development of several industry clusters along the coast. And although the government and Innovation Norway has been instrumental in setting up cluster programs, it has been a prerequisite that the clusters are owned and driven by the industry themselves. Much of the magic that happens in industries like this happens when companies and people work together to create solutions for tomorrow. Finally, I just want to briefly mention regulations, and this can also be a very important driver for development and innovation in the sector in Norway. I know Ragnar is coming after me and will take a deeper dive into this, but I just want to pay attention to the fact that regulations actually has been a key driver for innovation as well. And a good example has been the battle against sea lice in the salmon farming industry. This is a big problem, and when the regulations have been constructed in such a way that solving the problem is a prerequisite to allow the industry to grow, we have seen a multitude of suppliers developing solutions to overcome the problem for the growers. So with all these knowledge we have from the salmon industry, some people probably know that we some years ago tried to develop and repeat the history by developing cod farming. Norway looked at developing cod farming as the next big thing. And after all, we had succeeded well in salmon production, and how hard can it be to transfer this knowledge into a new species? A lot of the factors mentioned above here was already in place, but despite that, we didn't succeed. And in Norway, we were still debating what went wrong and who's to blame here. And there are probably a lot of answers to that questions. But my main point here is that building a new aquaculture production is very demanding, and there is no guarantee for success despite access to both competence, capital, plans, and strategies. And by that, I think that's my last slide. And I'll thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Øyvind. We had one question come up from David Klein at Auburn University. And he asked, is there a way to connect with the high school program or programs in Norway? It would be a great opportunity for US students to connect.
Actually, I got a similar question last week, actually, from Canada as well. I'm not familiar with any exchange programs on a non-academic level. There is an exchange program, at least between Canada and Norway, on an academic and PhD level. But that is for sure something we could look into as well. And I would perhaps, you probably have discussed that already, but I think a great way to kind of make those connections to the right institutions in Norway would be to attend the Aquanor expo taking place every second year, and the next one is taking place in August, end of August next year. So that could be a good arena to initiate those kind of discussions as well.
Okay, thank you. And I'll see if Dave has a follow-up question or anything that pops up in the chat or in the question box. As a reminder, everyone, please use the question box to ask any questions. We have a few minutes before our next speaker, so we can stay on time. Ask away. Oh, there's one here from Paul Zajac with the National Aquaculture Association, wondering if Norway is considering any other species for development that you care to share.
Not at the moment. I think we learned a few lessons when we started work on the cod. To be honest, the aquaculture industry in Norway is to a large extent kind of focused on salmon. There are some examples. We do have trout as well, which is kind of still fairly similar to the production of salmon. We have some mollusks, but to a fairly limited extent, I would say. So before, this has been the biggest part of the aquaculture industry in Norway. But what we could mention is that with the focus that has been on RAS technology the last few years, that opens up new opportunities. And I think the Norwegian suppliers industry has gained a lot of new competence with regards to other species, kind of land-based production. And that is probably kind of the way that has been working. I think for Norway, there will be still an emphasis on production of salmon, but the technology and the supplier industry, of course, see great opportunities in providing kind of good and advanced technology also for other kind of species.
Okay, thank you. David Klein had a follow-up on his education question. Do you think it would be possible for a virtual connection with the Norway high school or university programs for those here in the US to connect?
That we can definitely discuss. I can't kind of answer to them, but for sure we could help out on creating those connections as well. As you see, we have a kind of a wide network of offices also around in Norway, and we are kind of working close with the industry back home. So I think that should be definitely possible for us to discuss and see how we can accommodate that.
Okay, thanks. I can send David your contact information to get more details on how to do something like that after the meeting.
Sounds very good.
We had a meeting from Craig Browdy, says in the US there's a lot of pushback against aquaculture. How is that handled in Norway?
Well, we do have some pushbacks from time to time in Norway as well, and I think that is definitely worth paying attention to, and that is why we have been focusing so much on the sustainability aspects of the industry. The industry have been and will probably still be challenged from time to time on how you run your business. Is it sustainable, both with the social aspect, but also the environmental aspect of it. And I think it's important to kind of address those issues and not kind of try to park those discussions. We strongly believe that this is a great contribution to a more sustainable food production. And we do have pushbacks from time to time, but I think in Norway we have actually the advantage of having such strong ties to the identity and the culture and the connection with the ocean-based industries. So I think at least along the coast, you will kind of see the benefit of having this industry, despite the challenges that we might have from time to time. There's still a good internal support for the industry.
Okay, thank you. Paul Zajac had another question. Do you envision continued growth in production for Norway?
Well, definitely there is a plan to grow, but on certain conditions, and I think that would be a great segue into the presentation from Ragnar as well, kind of stating a little bit more and giving more details about how that is regulated, because it's not an unconditional growth that is allowed in Norway. You have to kind of fulfill a set of criteria, especially when it comes to sustainability and impact on the local environment and fish health. So yes, there is a political ambition is kind of well accepted, but the conditions are there as well.
Okay, I've got, I think, 2 more questions. First one's from Bill Dewey. He asked, are innovation clusters formal entities and encouraged and supported by the government?
Yes. So the cluster program in Norway is actually run by Innovation Norway in cooperation with the Research Council and another organization called SIVA. So that is definitely, it's partly funded and supported on different levels. We have kind of different, what you call, leagues of cluster development. So you kind of start with a bottom-up approach and testing out, is there room for us to cooperate? And if it is, and you kind of set some more hairy goals, you can kind of enter kind of the next league and advance and have a kind of a better funding and also better a more long-term financing.
Okay, and the last question I have before we move on is from Angela Caparelli, and she was curious if you knew the per capita fish consumption in Norway.
I don't have that kind of straight out of the head, but definitely along the coast we are kind of, we eat a lot of fish. It's fairly common to have 2, 3, 4 meals of fish a week. That was at least the standard when I grew up. Of course, food kind of eating habits change and the access to food change. But I would say we are, I think we are kind of have a higher consumption per capita than many other nations, for sure.